All right, good evening. I'd like to call to order the City of Lakewood City Council Workshop on December 5th, 2022. For those calling in tonight, that number is going to be 720-707-2699. And the webinar ID, whether you're calling in or joining via Zoom, is 820-6281-3086. And with that, I'll ask the clerk to please call.
Paul.
Here.
Abel.
Here.
Franks.
Here.
Jansen. Mayor Guerrero.
Here.
Over. Jarzai.
Here.
Springsteen.
Sorry, here.
Stewart.
Here.
Strong.
Here.
Vincent.
Here.
Mayor Paul, you have the floor.
Great, thank you. Well, I want to thank everybody for joining us this evening. It's been some time since we've done the workshop format. We were trying to remember tonight, and it might have been since policies and procedures that we've done that. And this gives us a nice informal opportunity to kind of work through some issues. We're faced with 12 different questions tonight, and if we spend 20 minutes on each, you can do the math and figure out where we'll be. So the idea is hopefully we get some consensus to move forward. At the end of the day, folks may just up or down vote, and that's where it'll be when we go to a public hearing. I would, before I turn it over to Mr. Smith, like to turn over to the chair of the Housing Policy Committee, Vincent, and then our former chair, Councilor Barb Franks, to give us a call.
So the STR, the workshop, the purpose of this is there was disagreement at the last ordinance that we brought forward. We came up, as was stated, with 12 areas of opportunity that we would like to come together on today. This will then go through legal back again and then to the ordinance. At that time, there will be public input on the second reading. There'll be no public input tonight. There were 21 to 23 comments on Lakewood Speaks. So that's where we're standing now. I'd like to just go through these questions and get some consensus to move it forward. And then I do my little speech of, you can please some of the people some of the time, but you can't please all the people all the time. And that's kind of where we are with the STR question. It's all over the board. I think what you can get a sense of, though, from people, it's a frustration that we haven't gotten anywhere yet. That they would like something on the books. And when you have an ordinance, if it needs to be changed later, you can, but at least you'll have some data to work with. So, anything like that?
Well, I really just want to thank everybody for all of the input. It has been a long process. We've certainly learned a lot. We certainly also know that communities are struggling. We've got New Orleans, which is put in place a moratorium on their application process. You've got the Fifth Circuit weighing in. You have other communities who are going through modifications. You have communities that are kind of have an ongoing modification program, knowing that they're trying to keep in front of that. So there's definitely a lot of moving parts, and it's hard to keep up on that. So I also want to acknowledge staff, that there's been a lot of questions across the 2 years, and some of those information has changed. And I just want to thank everybody for all the input. We've certainly learned a lot. And as Councilor Vincent said, perfection, I don't think any municipalities hit perfection yet. So I think it's one of those things where we will continue to learn, and we value the public's input. And thank you all for your comments.
Cool.
Are we ready?
I believe so.
All right. I'm going to go to question number 2 first, because I think question 1 may cause some further discussion. So the second one is, Council had consensus to strike the 180-day provision from the draft ordinance. Are we good on that? Okay.
Was there any alternative discussed other than the 180 days? Is it that or nothing?
That's what was in the ordinance that we brought forth for council. And council said they wanted to remove the 180 to have, what is it, 352, how many days are there?
300.
Thank you. Excluding holidays, 365.
So can I go on that?
Yes.
I think part of the issue is now you have the whole question one in question with the residency one, because I know there was a lot of concern and a lot of support for it in the community. So on both sides of that, with regards to things like snowbirds and half, the year here and half the year gone, and also trying to respect the fact that we do have homeowners who maybe are in the unit and they're renting, and for them, they're there, so they're figuring it's an activity where they're kind of monitoring that. So I think for me, it really depends where the whole thing with residency lands before I'm gonna feel comfortable with either days, distance, numbers and all that. So for me, it's the whole package that I'm interested in sort of seeing how that all comes together in order to then make a determination if how correct or right it is for the community at large based on my assessment. So that's why I'm saying at this point, I'm not gonna push back on that, but it depends on where residency goes and sort of what the circuit, how that weighs in on us as well.
I get the idea of what we wind up with tonight is what we'll be looking at as proposed ordinance. And my question went more to, did anyone bring up 240 days?
About 11, yeah, I'm going to start out 11 months is where I started.
So everyone wants to discuss. Okay. That was.
Yeah, and then trying to get council input before, because we've looked at this a couple of times, that's kind of where we landed.
Okay.
And based on, I think it's fair to say, input that we got from different folks, different constituents.
Thank you.
So, did you need anyone, Allison, I may ask you every once in a while, is that good? You got what you need, both of you? Okay.
Thank you.
Sure. The next one that we had is that council had consensus to no grandfathering would be allowed. That would prohibit somebody from handing my STR over to your STR license.
Or if you already have one, you're operating that you don't get to bypass
Automatically.
the requirements.
Right.
I feel like those are two separate issues.
Speak now.
Okay. The one to the other is more of a transfer.
Yeah, I would not call that
Transferable, no
grandfathering.
transferable.
Yeah, I would call that like transferable license. And I know you and I had discussed that, the potential of that, of investment, even with an investment.
Property, so going to sell the home or whatever,
Right.
and you can have it as an Airbnb. Yeah, I don't think we wanted to allow that.
Well, I definitely know my position was no, and I know that I can't speak for others, but I know that I was, if you're currently operating one, you would not be, you'd have to go through all the requirements. And if you have one operating, you would not be able to sell your home and say that it came with a license. I was opposed to both of those, so I can speak for myself.
And there
As
had
long as we're clear on the fact that those are both separate things. I guess I don't have huge objections.
so we're good on that, you can't transfer.
Can I just interrupt for a
Yeah.
moment? Because of the fact that we're also streaming and there are people on Zoom, we need to use our strong voices if we can, please, so that people online can also hear us. Thank you.
Okay. Now, what about the grandfathering piece then? I understand that that's some discussion. Because right now, if you looked at the information that I sent out, there's over 550, I think, illegal Airbnbs now happening.
I would say no grandfathering.
Yeah, I don't support grandfathering.
I mean, I would love us to think about what that looks like. Like, I'm also down for them, people to need to be compliant and go through like getting their license or however we like structure this, but I do hope that we would be able to not go from being like the day that this ordinance like takes effect, you know, all of you are getting fined, right? Like, right, if we maybe create an enforcement mechanism, then so there is that aspect of grandfathering that I think is a flag to me. That those 500 folks or owners or whatever, I don't want them to be like a white switch, like now you're in trouble, right? Versus like, okay, now you have 30 days to get compliant or something like that. Like we need to
It's
like
written now for 90 days to get.
okay, cool, great, yeah, that I feel totally good with that. I agree that we need to get compliant with the law, but
Are we good? Good for me? All right. So then, let's go through the parking definitions. Number 4. What do we do with that? Okay, parking is like one of the number 1 issues we deal with.
For me, this goes back to the primary residence question, because if you are renting, if your home is built and existing language, it seems to me that you've already met the parking requirement as outlined in code. And so if you're renting your home, some portion of it, you have, I guess it depends on if the homeowners are there as well, you get some of that parking application. And then in addition, that with renters. I think that the other question about primary residence would have some bearing on the decision for parking. But I would hate for us to create additional requirements here, because I think that just puts an undue burden on that.
So I certainly understand that, but you're also creating a business in a residential neighborhood, right? I mean, this is truly something that we've heard where you're creating business. So there is a concern with the neighbors about that and where people park. So I think maybe there's a balance that could be had, that there has to be some availability or provision to provide if possible.
What if we had different parking requirements based on the zoning classification of the Airbnb? Like, it feels very reasonable to me that if an Airbnb is operating in a neighborhood that is zoned for single family, I feel like it would be really reasonable to say that you must have at least one spot that is off street, even if it's just if it's in the driveway, that's off street. But if you're in one of our more highly densely populated areas, that there's literally no parking even for the owners.
People who live there.
Right, the people who live there, that feels like a totally different, like, expectation. The neighbors don't expect in a neighborhood like that people aren't going to be parking all over the street, because that's a function of like an urban neighborhood that is zoned more densely versus a neighborhood that is zoned like completely single-family.
Well, but I think you complicate, because if you just do it along those lines, like on my street, I have one of the wider streets, straight, you've got a lot of, you've got 3 cars, we have a 2-car garage, we have 3 cars that can park off street, so a total of 5 cars can be accommodated off street for us. And then we've got basically the street in front of us, which can accommodate 3 cars all our length. We have areas that are single family, that are heavily cul-de-sac, heavily, so they have a very unique, where oftentimes if they have a single car garage, they have a single car driveway, and the cul-de-sac offers no additional because of the way the are done. So I don't know that I have the answer, but I like a parking plan to at least address, so there's some expectations set. But again, I think none of this is perfect because we have such diverse street layouts, and like I said, if they're heavily hilled, there's a lot of cul-de-sacs. That isn't my neighborhood, but that is some of our neighborhoods where they're already stressed on parking. And we know this public parking is available for anyone. I mean, it's not like we assign those. So, and I do know we've got a parking management sort of plan that may help inform that. It could dovetail in. So I think all that comes together.
Yeah, I guess I just feel I'm sorry.
No, that's okay.
I just feel a discomfort with a blanket rule like this when that just is not the reality for every space in the city.
Well, and some townhomes and some condos only have 1 and a guest, so they only have 2. The others have to park on the street, and that's where some of the issues.
Parking issues all over town. And I don't think there's any 2 of them that are comparable to each other. We have a parking survey going on, or referred to. So I think anything we adopt now having to do with STRs So come with the caveat that could all change when we reach our final decision on citywide parking, how those rules are going to work. But I do agree right now that they can't take up every parking spot in front of their curb. I'm sure that with people across the street. So,
And that honestly is one of the complaints that we get.
it will take something more clever than I to come up with this temporary solution.
What if we, to Rebecca's point, we just had where there was maybe a requirement for one off street? You know, knowing that if I have a large party, my folks are gonna come and they're gonna come down the block and, you know, I'm having a birthday. So what we're trying to do is, because this will be more repetitive, is to come up with something that will maybe, like I said, be the entry step. And then once we've got the parking management analysis, we can kind of see what the pain points are. There might be a creative way to say, if it meets these 5 criteria, here's what needs to apply, and if it meets these other criteria. I think that's what that analysis would show us, and I don't think we would have that now, but certainly I would like them to at least have one off-street one where we can make sure, especially if we're only gonna have one contract at a time, that doesn't necessarily equate to one car, but it could. In many cases it could or would. So that might alleviate at least some of that stress in the initial periods.
Could we say one off-street parking spot unless you can prove that your residence actually comes with 0 off-street parking?
Right, because I feel like for folks in multifamily, we have, don't seem to have an issue with the zoning, very. So say if you are living in a multifamily unit and you don't have assigned parking, how could we then mandate for them to have off-street parking? That's for the SDR, and they don't really have that capability as the owner of the property as well.
Do we have an example property in mind where there is no deeded for a unit?
Space.
I guess I'm just trying to understand, since I don't, the experience I had in town.
Space.
You don't have a deeded space?
No.
Okay, no, I'm not familiar with that, so that's why I wanted to ask, so.
Yeah, so it's kind of free-for-all in an apartment complex that parking. So similar to people who are there not using STRs, if they would have a party, they would have a negative impact because it's not like these 4 spots are yours for unit A. It's really just this parking lot is available for your use. So that level of nuance, I think, is what makes it hard.
It does.
A lot of the new or the more recently built multifamily sell parking spaces. You know, I think Beacon charges $150 a whack. So supposedly you would own that parking spot and be able to lease it out along with the unit, but do they, Beacon, for instance, would they be patrolling their garage saying, oh, yeah, this person's a resident, has paid up, and oh, what's this out of town, this out of state vehicle doing here? They're not paying. So.
But couldn't the parking plans, if we just said that there's a parking plan and if there's the ability to have an off-street, that would be the first choice. And if they can't, they just need to demonstrate there is no, that it's not that type of a development. So that caveat gives you what you're looking for. Because again, I'm trying to envision those and not sure that there's going to be a lot of, depending on the ownership of the overall complex, which they can control different rules that may supersede our rules. I don't want to get too far in the weeds since we don't know which HOAs may be open.
But like, I'd be able to prove that I don't have.
Exactly, that you don't have.
But that there's adequate parking. Yeah, like, we're gonna take my complex as an
Example.
example.
Sure, why not? No, but I think that would be, I could do a reasonable compromise on these ones. Yeah.
So then have at least one off-street parking availability unless otherwise noted. And then I think we would have to put a line in there that maybe modified dependent on the parking management plan.
What if we just didn't try to put it into the licensing process and instead put in an enforcement mechanism where if there's a police with an STR that is getting repeated parking complaints, that there's like, where it's like, that's then the thing, and then they have to give us a parking plan. I just feel like this idea that like, there are just so many places where like, I mean, you think about like the, you know, the West Line, right? And it's like Westland and West Line. Got it, yeah. But the, you know, like that's a place, for example, where like, if that person leaves their car while they're out of town or whatever, right? Like there's not an additional option for them, but like that is already a shit show, the parking, excuse my like very language. And so there's like that level of issue, but it's like, do we really want to like legislate that into this place where like it's, do you know what I mean? Like I have a hard time imagining that like the percentage of an Airbnb cars at any given moment in that exact community is actually going to have this like statistically important impact, given that it's like already an issue, right? So like, I just like, I want to steer us away a little bit from this idea of like, we really want to make responsible parameters. We really want to minimize negative impacts to neighbors, but we really want to allow for people, particularly those who like need it, to be able to supplement their income in this way at a time when housing is so accessible. And like, I think that, that this is like kind of putting up a level of both like difficulty on that person's side, but then also on our side to be able to like look at it, read it, figure it out. Is it right? Is it wrong? Versus like on the other side of things where we can react to complaints that they're really kind of for a particular address.
I was gonna add to that too. You know, my thought is that it was the nuisance code would catch that. So if there's a number of nuisance calls here with that, could nuisance be, nuisance complaint be responsible for parking issues as well?
So are you saying to put it into the nuisance ordinance?
Well, no, I'm just wondering if, like, in general, if I had an issue with my next door neighbor and I said that he has excessive parking, this is outside of short-term rentals. I said, you know, this neighbor is a pain and he has parking issues, and I called in and code enforcement would come for that. Is that something that code enforcement would respond to in general?
Yeah, but it's extreme though, it's like 7 cars.
We have
I'd like to point out that one of the main themes running through these comments the public submitted was keep it simple, stupid.
Yeah.
And I think the more complex we make parking, the more complex we make other issues, the harder it is for folks to operate. So, you know, but that, there again, that might call for fewer accommodations, or it might call for fewer restrictions. That's, I think we need to keep that in mind with everything we discussed tonight. Is let's make it as easy as possible for people to follow the rules. Make the rules as clear as possible.
I agree. I think you had a comment about the code enforcement, or you look like you were.
I was just going to say, Mayor Paul, actually, generally it's like you can't have more than 7 vehicles parked on your property. Code enforcement is generally more concerned with parking on like an unimproved surface, more so than the street parking aspect of it. So code enforcement will be able to help, but our current nuisance code for parking doesn't necessarily touch on the idea of parking in front of the street on the street.
Yeah.
So then would it be, could we write it in by zone? So if you did your single family zone, and you said, or take that back and you say one is applicable or there is one, utilize it, or those things that could be legally defensible, or do you have to treat everybody the same?
It would depend on, I think you'd have to have good evidence to show the different dynamics of the different neighborhoods to make sure that it's fair to everybody, because some people may say, oh, well, they can have 7 cars, but I'm only allowed to have 1. But if we can show, by example, that if you're in mixed use or something like that, that there just is not as much parking there, then you'd be able to defend it, but we would need to have that evidence, and I don't have any of that information in front of me tonight. It would be complicated to get that going. With the current iteration of the ordinance, it would probably take a lot of restructuring to do the parking based on something.
So we're creeping.
What just happened?
We're on mission creep
Okay.
from our assignment before us.
There's another caveat here, and that is that when we compiled our comprehensive plan, one of our council people at the time suggested that, just escaped me, Adam made the suggestion that we maintain the character of our neighborhoods that's in the comp plan. So I think we need to keep that in mind with all of this tonight too. How much does it change the character of the neighborhood if there are 20 cars parked along the curb between two residents or encompassing two residents? So, and maybe it doesn't affect it at all.
I think it's the way that it's written sort of is kind of reinforcing what we're saying. You know, it's saying that the parking has to be reflective of what's required from the zoning and that license premise. And so to Charlie's point, like, I think we raise it because it's worth talking about, but I would be fine with keeping it this way. Personally. Sorry.
So, no, so 20 minutes ago,
That's okay, we need to do the first two shots.
yeah. Is that okay with everybody, leaving it the way that it is? It was brought up just because people wanted to discuss it.
Well, I do think we're going to, over time, we're going to need those data points. I think
Yes.
when we have the data points, when we can see what's actually happening, and then we get parking. So I think that it's one of those unknowables at this point. You're not going to know until we get some experience, and that's uncomfortable for someone who, like me, likes data, because I know data now, and make a decision. But I do agree that, but I think we're going to have to be ready to be very nimble and make sure, again, the primary goal we have on council is health, safety, and welfare of our communities. And so we want to make sure that we're doing the best in the broadest sense we can for the entire community.
Would you be comfortable with a 6-month look back or a 1-year look back so that we can?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it depends on where we end up with the overall one. So once we get to that point, that would be,
If you want that,
definitely
it's
consider.
gonna take a while.
Absolutely.
Exactly, yeah, because it's gonna take a while for everybody to get on and then to see what happens. Yeah.
And
So-
I think that
No,
I think that that's like of interest too, because I think, you know, as we're looking at, you know, really the consolidation of some of the parts right off of Sheridan, right? Like that is also going to change things. Like I think that downtown Denver has specific parking requirements that is different than other parts of Denver based on that, because there's literally no parking that's not like 2 hours or it's a ton for a lot. So they have those types of requirements depending on how long-term the Airbnb is. So there's just like other models, but we're not actually downtown Denver at all, right, is my point. So I do like this idea that it may take time and I'm comfortable with the language as it is. But I'm glad that we talked about it, because I really wanted to get clarity on that.
And are we seeing if Mr. Springsteen has raised, is anybody monitoring to see if?
I am.
Okay, just want to make sure that somebody's seeing if she's got any questions.
Okay, now this one, I think, this next one, which is number 5, you're doing a very good job, Mr.
Thanks.
Smith, thank you.
College educated figure.
Yeah. This one was a definition around calls for service, a clarification. This kind of started going into the weeds when we had the last meeting. What does that mean? Who can rat out who, and all that kind of thing. So the calls for service, and correct me if I'm wrong, anybody who's been on this program, the intent of that is our police calls. Those are the calls for service. If it's a noise violation, if it's drugs, if it, whatever that could be. And then how do you monitor that and how many? I think in here it said 3, I think in the ordinance, did it 3 calls for
Well,
service?
I think the clarification the folks were looking for was that if I'm the person staying in the short-term rental, and I've been the victim of a crime, it is not a call for service if I call to report that I've been the victim. That doesn't count against the STR. Like
Yes.
if I say that, places that I've broken into, I've been assaulted, that wouldn't count because I'm reporting a crime. We're really looking at the valid complaints, and they have to be valid, obviously, that those have been validated, that their calls for service due to a complaint about the activity of the STR. I just want to make sure I'm looking at Gus to see if I'm getting that correctly. So it was really to make sure that people weren't courage from reporting a crime. We want people to report a crime, and we don't want that to be looked at as saying that we count against the STR. So I think that's the.
I think so, sorry, that what was hard, there was two spots that this was brought up, and the first one, it was very explicit that it was, calls relating to the short-term rental.
Yeah.
Because what we didn't want is to discourage someone, let's say who's in a domestic violence situation, who's the owner of the home, they feel like because there was a call that sort of met all those requirements, was criminal report, a police response, that was in one of those, right? It has to be directly related to the short-term rental. But then the second time that it's mentioned, that's less clear. So if I recall, Sophia was the one that brought this up, but that it needed, the second listing of this maybe just needed to clarify that that was criminal in response to any, with the short-term rental.
Yeah, I think that's a clarification.
That's my recollection of that conversation.
It also says two, not very good.
Okay, so leave it two.
I would like to have it.
Use of words around.
Two is enough to like have a plan. I think two is reasonable. Like, I don't think that means that you get shut down, but I understand, I think it means that you have to like show
That you're making improvements, kind of like the hotel motel.
Yeah.
It's really.
And there's great, that's why you have that sort of discretionary, because there's a grade of something being different. I mean, there's minor, somebody parked, in somebody else's driveway by mistake or covered their driveway versus there was some activity here that was really problematic. So I think over time, you have to kind of classify those, but in the short term, I wouldn't feel the need to.
And it does say that this is a thing that shows cause to suspend or revoke. It's not to ask for a,
Yeah, because there'll be a show
mitigation
cause
plan.
hearing too.
Should we make a distinction between code violations and criminal violations? I mean, if somebody's been leaning on the horn outside of STR, trying to get their friends to hurry up, and somebody calls and complains about the noise, that would seem to be a less egregious violation than somebody who has threatened a neighbor or started a fire or some other criminal activity, using fireworks, for instance, that sort of.
Is a call to code enforcement a call for service?
That's what I'm trying to do. Do you get it?
Yeah.
It would be. It's defined as, it results in a criminal report, and our code enforcement is under the police department. So it would be, that would count.
Couldn't we, because again, it's going to be reviewed, could we not get some data points behind? Because again, it becomes that sort of, I don't know how much we're going to be able to solve for with not really having any, because when we asked about the numbers from code enforcement, there's not a high number that we can use as data points. I've asked for that over the course of 2 years, multiple times. There's not enough data to be able to make a, what I would call an informed decision. It would be throwing a dart. So it feels like I'm less comfortable doing that. So I'm fine sort of maybe leaving it where it's at. And then to Charlie's point, the 6-month look back, let's just start to look at those data points and see where we might need to put some more, language in there that defines how you guys feel about that as maybe a starting point and then look back.
But see, I'm all for gathering data, if we don't know what we don't know yet with this, so getting some data and looking back on it, I think is a fair way to do things.
I mean, is it actually, like I'm only looking at the top part where it says it, and I know it says it again like later, and so I don't know. But what's maybe you guys can remind us, what's the current thing in here about like what happens after getting to violations or reports?
So it's under 5.55070, and the language leading into it says that for show cause hearing, the city clerk may request that the authority suspend, revoke, or not renew a license and the authority may issue an order to show cause when a license should not be, why a license should not be suspended or revoked for any or the following. And then this is number 5, and it says the licensed premises calls for service is at or above 2 or more calls for service for any 12-month period or significant criminal act that has occurred on the premises. So it's not mandatory the second that they have 2. So there is a review. If there's something like a neighbor that's very unhappy with it, just keeps calling and code enforcement keeps coming out and making reports saying nothing substantiated, that wouldn't be one that the city clerk would likely or would have any reason to go forward on. If they did, the hearing officer would still have the ability to say that that's not a substantiated violation.
Words like substantial are fairly pejorative. So I think we need to make that as specific as possible.
Was that in for is that in relation to the word like the significant criminal event? That's a defined term.
It is.
So it is a defined term. It's defined in the lodging code.
Lodging license.
Yes, so it's, which I believe will be coming up in front for review for some updates to that very definition. So it is defined.
Okay, great. Thank you.
I mean, I'd still personally like to increase it to 3. I just feel like 2 happens in a single weekend from a single occupant. So like the owner wouldn't have necessarily an opportunity to like deal with it.
But it's just a hearing, it's not an immediate repercussion.
Right, I recognize that. I'm saying like if the point of it is that like the owner is able to like have an opportunity to like realize that there's a problem or something ongoing, that they need to be vetting the people differently or talking to their neighbors differently or whatever, requiring other things. I don't think that 2 will actually like allow them that opportunity necessarily. I think it's really common where you end up with like one tenant who's like bad for a weekend or whatever, a couple of days of them staying there, and then you end up, you know, having that one person like basically gets a couple of the calls, and then right, like even in a single night, like if the first noise complaint doesn't shut it down, and then like, you know, folks come back an hour or 2 later, like that's 2. And I also feel like I just like don't actually share the like nervousness that maybe others feel about what I think happens in short-term rentals.
Don't characterize what we're feeling.
I
I'm
apologize.
not nervous.
Well, some of us have experience with ones that have not gone well and have been very difficult on the community. And we've also had ones that are, you would never even know they were there because of the neighbors around who said, you know, that they are operated in such a way that you never know. So I think we have those those 2 things going on. I'm more comfortable staying with 2 and knowing that the discretion is there to look at the gravity. So for me, I'm the 2.
And I'm very much for 2 to do. Because that's what's come back as one of the sticking points. So 2 at least gives you something to react to. I mean, put data on that too. The thinking behind it is that if you have somebody who's so irresponsible and hasn't done their due diligence to loan it to 8 partiers or whatever, when there's only supposed to be 2 there, then that gives the discretion to the folks to look at that. That's the thinking behind it.
Would the process be more like a show cause hearing?
Yeah.
Precisely.
Thank you. I'd go for 2.
I don't think I'm gonna get comfortable with 2, and I think that's okay. I'm in the agree.
I'd go 3.
Great.
2 for 3. We can always get data on it too, you know, and public, there's nothing says we can't publish. I'll tell you, once it's at 3, it'll be harder to lower it to 2 than when it's at 2, to up it to 3.
Right. I think to look back could help with that as well.
And then we seem very, you know, nobody's doing this, let's up it to 3. And that's easy to do.
I would hate to say, but I would stick with 2 because it feels more aligned with the lodging license at 1.86.
Yeah,
So it feels like there's some consistency in the approach. And could we then note this for the look back to suggest that this would be something, is that too low? Is that been turned too low?
I think if you're the aggrieved neighbor, 2 is too many. I say 2.
And why does it pay you to say that?
Well,
You don't
I
have to be
feel like, I just want us to, I like the momentum we had at the beginning.
Still consensus.
So does that work for everybody, whether we agree with it or not?
Yeah, I just think the look back will be, I just think that's gonna be the key on it.
Oh,
It's easier to go from 2 to 3 than 3 to 2.
2, yeah. That really gets me. Okay, lodging tax generated by STRs and its use in the enforcement of STR codes. I know there was some information that came out that the taxes are being paid. That's on the businesses though that are located in Lakewood. I forget what they are, Airbnb or something. So those businesses are paying taxes to Lakewood. But the individual Airbnb is not paying any taxes.
So it's anyone that's operating like through Airbnb, I think there were 2 that were collecting. Airbnb is collecting and remitting the taxes, but if anyone's operating not on those platforms, taxes are not being collected.
That is correct.
VRBO is not paying taxes right now.
But we
Yeah,
can
the
change,
CRGO is not in Lakewood.
we can change that. If we tax some people because of their platform and then don't tax other people because they're not on a platform, I think that would be discriminatory.
No, it's just that we don't have anything set up.
Oh, I know.
Yeah, so once we go through this, then we create the process, and then the part of the requirement of the license is the tax is submitted regardless of who you are.
Sure, and we're going to make that process as easy as possible too, because dealing with tax regulations.
If you remember the first one, there was like a 9 by 11 sheet of taxes. I think we're down to what, 3 maybe now or something? Since we're lodging license and business.
We're not talking double taxing people who like Airbnb is already pulling those taxes out. They're
No, just
And that brings up a point that I ran into in the comments, and that is that someone said the way it is set up, it costs $677.50 in monthly fees. Is that correct?
No.
Could be. Cleaning falls under.
That's not a fee. That's an expense.
But so does Airbnb charges fees for doing the whole thing.
Oh, that's not our problem. That's Airbnb.
Right.
We're talking about city fees.
Well, they're talking, they said
$70 a month, that's.
Yeah, that was just,
That's.
if you have a hotel maybe.
Yeah, how much are you
I
charging?
was just concerned.
Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. Was there a hand?
That was my suggestion, I certainly agree.
Counselor Springsteen, did you have something?
Yeah, I just wanted to make the comment that I think we finally got to the heart of all this, which is revenues for the city. Because in years and years of going through all of these same issues with group homes, nobody could have cared less. And now they do, because we can generate some revenue. So wonderful. I'm so glad we found a way to care about the community that way.
Thank you.
Well, I guess I'm confused.
Yeah.
My understanding was that it was to ensure that we didn't have an unlevel with our businesses like a Fairfield or others, that because these would be in direct competition, that
It's
it was.
regulatory equality, right?
Yeah, it was basically an equal tax, that way we weren't, favoring one over the other. So I guess I want to make sure that's where I'm.
Group homes are
okay.
different, it's a totally different.
Okay, I just want to make sure that I was understanding the situation correctly.
The ones I know about that have been paying some. Are we okay then with the taxes that were in there? And understanding the difference between Airbnb and also too, I don't think this is off track, but do we have to look at those businesses that are doing a platform here that are not paying taxes to us, or is that, because there was only 2 out of 3 that were registered in Lakewood. So that meant one was not paying us at all, but they were doing.
Well, there's dozens. So I think if you're really looking, I mean, there's niche players, all kinds of things for, the concert goer or the this or the that. So I think it's really everybody has to, I mean, this is a lodging tax. If you're offering that, if the platform's not collecting it, it is your responsibility to collect it and to remit it to the city on, I think, a quarterly basis or something, whatever the time scale is. But
So that would probably be something that will come up.
Since I just looked through and this is kind of our spot, we're talking about the lodging tax. So there was another public comment and I just want to make sure that these numbers are correct. That the lodging license costs $750 for the first year and then $400 for renewal.
I don't have the information in front of me right now. I can try to pull it up.
well, that's different from this. This is the cost per night, like what you pay if, like if I go to Boston, which has some of the highest, it's what's tacked onto my rooms, $200 a night. It's that tax, it's not the licensing fees and that, which is separate. This is more the tax for the individual lodging that you would pay if you went over to the Fairfield or something to rent.
Then if that is not appropriate for this slide, that's fine, but could we find out how much the lodging license actually costs before the end?
They're not set.
I didn't think
They're
it
not
was
set,
that.
okay.
No, it states that the city council can set those by resolution, so they'll be set by this body separate from adopting regulations.
So
They may have seen something that was thrown out.
Yeah, hotel motel, that might be, is that 753 something?
That, I honestly, I'm not
that's
sure what the numbers are there.
But it has to be defensible by the time that's put into it, right? That's the key piece.
It's the actual cost. You can't, you have to charge what it's
It's not a
cost for the
revenue.
administrative, it's not so they're revenue generator.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So we're not going necessarily by the hotel motel.
No.
Application process, okay, cool.
I think there were some numbers that were thrown out originally about what it would cost to cover the people's time. I'm pointing to Jay.
Yeah, no, definitely. I guess I misunderstood that we are asking for a lodging license and we're doing lodging taxes, that we are going to be setting a different application and renewal fee versus the current ones that hotels and motels currently have to do right now. And we're treating it separately.
Correct.
Okay.
Council had consensus to eliminate on-premise residents from the draft ordinance. How are we seeing that? Okay.
Depends on how we sit on the board.
Hopefully right now. And consensus here is used like majority, so. 8, home business definition, including within zoning code, impact upon the zoning code, categories, major and minor.
Can you maybe elaborate on that?
You guys are the ones who came up with the issue.
This all came because we had a very robust discussion across the 2 years about businesses.
Right.
And the fact that we don't let every type of business operate. If I'm a mechanic, I can't have an auto repair shop in my garage and operate that. So there's these high impact businesses, which would be in the major category, low impact businesses. And it became, well, we encourage businesses as a community, but there are impacts of those, and how does this then fit into that sort of major and minor? How does it play out? Is our STRs considered under the major category, or would it be more fall in line with the minor, so we can leverage existing code? It doesn't mean you have to, but it was sort of around that whole thing. And remember, we talked today sort of about that, there's obviously, if you're a home accountant, when somebody comes to get their taxes done, that might be considered a low, you have this occasional person who comes, drops off their box of paperwork, and you're doing that. And you have another one where it's much more invasive to the community. So I think that those are the kinds of, that's kind of a key to the major versus minor, and do we have a kind of consensus on sort of what we anticipate their level of impact to be. But frankly, I don't know how it parses out in code zoning and all. I don't know that it really gets us, I don't know if the distinction now gets us anywhere different. So I'm not sure it's really, without data points, I don't know if we're really be able to classify it.
So we're kind of setting that already by licensing it, but I know what you're saying.
It was a robust discussion at least a couple of years ago, for sure.
Because like, do we need to know this stuff?
That's what I'm saying, but we wanted to make sure that everyone knew that it had been brought up so many times that we didn't want to just gloss by it without making sure you all had an opportunity to weigh in.
I'll say too, from like the current housing policy group, I know that this was a question that we inherited from the former body. And I think what we, as I remember, the conversation sort of moved us away from this. So as long as people feel clear on the history of it, I'm not sure that this needs to be, in my opinion.
I agree.
Mine too.
At this point, I agree. It could change once we have data.
Our zoning ordinance, I believe, addresses the difference between major and minor home businesses. And I think those are the standards we should use, because if we don't, then somebody who has a similar impact on a neighborhood but is categorized differently would have a valid complaint.
Which one, when you look at that, I had a hard time sort of because, again, those examples I gave earlier where you wouldn't even know it was being operated that way, when you could say, well, it would be minor, but then you have the other ones where it had high volume, high turnover, almost, day rent. That seemed more, so I guess that's where I struggle, where do you then, each one's so unique, how do you kind of put it in one bucket, but I'm curious to hear.
I think traffic and parking are two of the elements that go into that. And I hate to throw parking back into the mix, but is anyone familiar with the restrictions to which I refer?
Major and minor business.
Major and minor and the impacts.
So yes, there's I can get to that. There's also something to consider in the definition of major and minor business in the zoning code. Neither of them truly fits when we're discussing short-term rentals. I'll just read it from the code. It's defined at 17.14.2. And for a minor home business, it says the commercial activity does not exceed 25% of the combined square footage of the dwelling unit, garage, and accessory structures. So if you're renting out the whole home, that doesn't really work. And then for major home businesses, it's also defined at 17.14.2. It says the commercial activities exceeds 25%, but is not greater than 50% of the combined square footage of the dwelling unit, garage, and accessory structures. So our current definitions as they are don't necessarily fit for short-term rentals. It seems to be more intended for if you're going to run a business, you need to run it out of a room or two of your home. So if it's a whole home STR, we would have to modify the definitions to get those to fit as home businesses as currently incorporated in our ordinance.
If I might,
yes,
whole term STR could be treated differently than a 1 or 2 room STR. The whole home impact might be greater, but if we make an exception for this, right now, I want to bring up a sore subject the mayor had preferred us not to speak of, but group homes aren't even classified as home businesses.
Mm-hmm. That's true.
So, I'm not sure where to go with these things. I think it's the square footage or the percentage of the unit would be fairly relevant.
So Charlie, though, wouldn't it be that rather than maybe trying to fit, this round peg into maybe a square hole, that the licensing structure itself sort of becomes it's separate? And if the data points show that we need to come back and amend that and we need to end up with some sort of maybe subdividing, but it seems to me like we could spend a lot of time talking through this, and I don't know that we're based on the fact that it doesn't currently fit, which is the struggle I was having on major and minor, that we put this as part of the look back, that we make it a line item and look back, would that be acceptable? To kind of come back and say,
I think the look back's a good idea. One of the other conditions of a differences between a major and minor business is that a major business can only be located at the intersection of a arterial and Collector Street.
It's one moment, sorry, I'm gonna go into the paperwork here. It is, a major home business shall be located on a lot or lots that are within 150 feet of the intersection as measured from the back of curb or edge of asphalt, of 2 arterial streets or 2 collector streets, or collector street with an arterial street. So absolutely, you had that definition down.
So that definition would be kind of self-limiting on the number of
Rooms.
STRs as home businesses.
Yeah, I think.
So,
well, I think that I'm interested in where you're going with that, but depends on where the whole residency thing turns out to. I think that they kind of become, because again, if we're trying to say that it's a major business, then it's self-limiting based on locale. I get where you're going with that. But if we're trying to, on the flip side, kind of come up with a solution that would work on our keeping homes in very interior neighborhoods, on very neighborhood streets, then it doesn't. So for me, I won't be able to kind of go down that path until I see more how the residency rule plays.
well, I wasn't making an editorial statement as to my preference. I was pointing out what our regulations require.
Right.
So if we decided to make it a major on, everybody would know that would be self-limiting.
Understood.
And even if it's minor, it could be conducted in anybody's, in half of anybody's garage. So, and everybody.
Understood.
Rebecca had a comment.
I would, since we're going for consensus, my preference would be to leave this for now and utilize the fact that we're doing a lodging license, and then perhaps take this discussion back up and a look back if it feels necessary.
Will that work though, since we don't have the definition within major, minor, or whatever? We don't have STRs. There are no STRs now. So where would we put that? We'd have to address that, correct, before we say we're going to have STRs, or at the same time.
I think one way, and I want a little more time to fully flesh out the idea, but you would list a short-term rental in our use table in the zoning code as a specific use that is different from major or minor home business. And so if that short-term rental is allowed in a certain zone district, then the business of short-term rental is allowed there separate from the major or minor. But Allison and I will probably need to wrap our heads around that one. So that's a bit of a riddle.
If we just call them a minor home business, categorized that way, then we wouldn't have the question to deal with.
That's one way to do it. There would still be the limiting language in the definition of business as limited to 25% of the square footage of the home. So it's a difficult one. But if we adjusted that definition, then yes.
I would suggest that we do that. We just eliminate the reference to the percentage of the home, of the unit that's used for STR.
Yeah.
All the minor businesses.
And if that ends up working,
But doesn't that, if we change that, then that changes it for every business, does it not?
I don't think so. I think we could always exempt them from being either minor or major as we
I think
have
that's what
good
Gus was
policy.
that's what Gus was
That's a good
suggesting.
idea.
I think that's what that's.
If you exempt them from being businesses, you can't charge them sales tax.
right. I think,
Well, that speaks to Gus's, I think, is suggesting, so we'd like you to flesh, I think, why don't you say that, I think we might have consensus for you guys to flesh that out a little bit more.
Understood.
and then I think Anita had a comment, and then Mayor Paul had a comment.
Yeah, thank you. So on this particular issue, whether it's major or minor, I think this idea of square footage is not a sufficient way to look at it, because maybe you only rent out a room or two, but you rent out to, you're not a responsible STR renter, and you rent out to crazy people who are gonna party all the time or something. I mean, so the percentage of space doesn't really determine the impact, I would say. So there needs to be some other criteria there. But so someone had put my hand down before when it was raised on a couple of the other issues, but I just wanted to mention on enforcement, when we had talked about code enforcement going after this, and we're charging this cost for code enforcement. I mean, we have so many complaints about code enforcement already not doing what people expect them to do. And I know in the city of Denver, they have an entire department dedicated to enforcement on this, which I think is absolutely ridiculous to put those kind of funds into it. But I don't think we have a good resolution on enforcement, and I don't think it's fair for us to say we're charging for those expenses when it's not really going to be enforced. And then finally, one of my concerns with this all along has been everybody's so concerned about affordable housing and housing options and people being able to afford the housing they're in. This to me seems like against all of those ideals. Like, we're saying, no, you can't provide affordable housing to others. No, you can't support your own housing with the income you get from this. And so I just feel like this is like the anti-affordable housing thing. And I wanted to point that out. But anyway, thanks.
Thank you.
So, and just to set expectations, a 6-month look back is going to probably won't be on our time frame. I think it's going to take at least 6 months to get this thing up and going. So you're probably going to be into next year just to set those expectations.
And we make it 6 months after the first license is issued.
I mean, I think when we get to that point, I think we'd have to defer to the timeframes that staff has as far as when we prepare for second reading and then 90-day compliance, and then when does that trigger? But just to set it, and then we'll have more conversation, but that was pointed out that could be ambitious at just 6 months.
And I have no objection to it. Yeah. As long as we look back.
Sorry, I've got Councilmember Jansen is on my screen over here. It's not on this screen here. She had her hand up for a moment, so I don't know whether she has a question or not, but I can see you, Councilmember Jansen. I'm not certain the room can see you. So if you got a question, you probably should unmute and ask the question, and hopefully you'll show up. No question? Oh, no question.
No question. Okay. Wow, you've got the secret over there to see all. Let's see, nuisance call review, we did that. I do believe.
9?
Yeah, to 9, sorry.
I think this is going to come back with potential language that would better clarify what a STR is.
Come back with some different language, and it may need to go to the planning commission if we're going to be touching the zoning code. So there may be some additional steps that need to be taken if we're going to do all of that, but we'll get that squared away.
And keep me honest, I have a tendency to keep going. So if you don't have all the information you need, let me know, okay?
I appreciate it. Thank you. I'll rewatch this.
All right. Okay, for number 9, I have nuisance calls review. I feel like we covered some of that, but.
Yeah, I feel like.
Yeah, is everybody okay with that? Okay. 10, Number of inspections, that seemed to be, do we have too many? Do we have too few? How often should they be inspected? And I think it went all over the board. So.
Denver has imposed inspections for a number of things, rental units in general, and Airbnb. So I have a struggle with that. I'm not sure that the inspectors are available to do this.
Well, that's what we have to look at too.
They're like 9 months behind.
Yeah.
So that would be an impediment to folks opening up. However, we have had a number of complaints about people who live in multifamily. Some multifamily affordable units don't have heat or don't have water or they have mold. So if we can't provide the inspectors, then it's a burden on the would-be operators. But if we don't inspect, then it could be a burden on folks who come in and spend a week in someplace that's mold infested. So
what do you do?
Yeah, well, my take is where I'm most concerned is really about getting the initial license. And the reason being, when we finished our basement, we were required, and rightfully so, to do an egress window. It was the old style basements, very small windows. If there would have been a fire down there, that had been by the stairway, anybody elderly would have had great difficulty getting out. So we were required to cut open a very big opening, which now is egress. What I want to make sure of is that we had a person pass away, a house flooded. They were not able to get out of the home. I want people, if we're going to go down this path and ultimately allow STRs, that people who rent are safe. There's escape, there's an ability to get out. So the initial one is the most important one for me, to make sure things are up to code. There's no faulty, wiring, that people are safe. There's a fire extinguisher. There's carbon monoxide detectors. It's very clear how you would get out if there were to be an issue. So that the initial one is the most important one for me. I can be very flexible on anything else, on anything subsequent.
how well prepared are we to do the initial inspection?
Gus, did you have something you look like you were going to say something?
Oh, I just may have that kind of look on my face sometimes, but not that you're all the gamers, you have something to say. For the inspections, the inspectors are actually certified home inspectors, so they're not going to be on staff. So maybe
Denver's using the same mechanism,
and
they're
they're
not finding.
Okay.
So that's my concern.
It's labor. I wasn't aware of that. Okay, wow.
So that would cause a significant lag time, but then again, if we don't inspect, there could be problems. It would be.
That's very true.
Could be fatal.
So we have a 90-day lag time potentially, right? To start to notify and to get people's inspections lined up. I think third party, but I would say certainly an initial would make sense.
But you wouldn't even be, the way this is written now in 5.55030C, the license renewal, you couldn't submit even for a license if it didn't include that inspection. So does that then become a barrier if we're at, as you're saying, a 9-month lag time, then our whole license is lapsing because they couldn't get the inspection in time, but the renewal process is still what I'm speaking of.
Yeah, could you allow for it to, they have to have it by the granting of the license, so that way it's not upon the whole paperwork process, but it could be the last piece upon granting the license, that's the last piece that you need, which would give you the most time to get it done.
Well, if there's a checklist, we could also potentially look at during that initial period where we know we're going to have a lot to process, that could be that you provide visual evidence of, because I could literally take a picture of here's the egress window in the basement, which means that the sleep. I don't know, but I'm just saying if we're trying to make sure that we don't make the lack of maybe inspectors the impediment, if we're all completely use of houses or heating. But I'm firm on it needs to be before it can be occupied, before you can put people into a larger unit.
Can we do a renter's complaint process some way that go ahead and license them, and but if somebody calls and says, oh my God, I'm staying at this place and there's no heat, then we, my concern is we don't want them to necessarily burden the operators, but then again, we're in danger of the would-be renters.
Mary, you had your hand up?
Yes, I do. So I just looked at Denver and they don't have require in-person inspections, but the licensees must certify under penalty of perjury that their short-term rental has functioning fire extinguishers, carbon monoxide detectors, smoke alarms, and liability insurance to cover bodily and property damage. So I don't know, just look that up. Thanks.
Do we know if Airbnb and Vrbo require those kind of things too?
Yeah.
So I think that
They do? Okay.
yeah, so that's kind of cover that.
I
So it's not,
So it's, you know, but it is required.
Sure.
I'm sorry, Rachel.
Oh, I was, that, but I have more.
Okay, but yeah.
Of all the discussion points here, I did notice one about the tiered approach. And I thought we had discussed that in the last meeting and decided that we wanted at least a two-tiered approach. And so I'm going to bring it up now because the number of inspections, I think we're losing sight of the renters that are trying to rent from Airbnb or VRBO. They're not expecting full-blown hotels with, they're expecting somebody's house. They're not expecting as many things, I think, as we're talking about, that when they're in somebody's house.
They're expecting fire escapes.
Yeah.
Yes.
No.
They're expecting.
Right, but you can't get your mortgage approved if there's rooms that don't have.
But they're not expecting as thorough protection as a hotel. I would say that.
But I don't think that anybody here is suggesting that like you need to have amenities. They're saying that you need to have code enforcement, right? Like.
Well, the code, yes, but I still think there's a little bit of a gap between what Airbnb would provide, a homeowner would be able to provide, and a hotel.
You think they both need carbon monoxide detectors?
Yeah. Yeah, I would go along.
Can you give an example then?
Yeah,
Like, what's the difference?
I'm trying to zero in.
But, well, okay, let's go down the whole road. Okay, if we had a tiered approach, my first tier is my aunt or somebody like that who is on Social Security, and that's it, and they rent their place out and read a little bit, a small bit. Let's say less than 30 days, let's say less than 90 days. I don't really want to burden them with all these inspections and licensing. I would leave them alone, actually completely alone.
Because she's living there?
Yes, and they would have to live there. And yes, she's living there. She needs extra money to make ends meet, and not eat cat food or, and afford medical care, things like that. Just a little bit of money, right? So this is a very basic, low-level thing I'm talking about right there. And so I don't want to burden her with inspections and a bunch of other things. I would just leave them out. But then when you get up to another tier, then you have somebody that has a house next door and it's completely low. Yeah.
First thing.
The next tier would be somebody's house. They're renting out the house. Then you have another tier where it's a flat out business and they have 6, 7 houses or something. I see the people on the higher tiers should be doing more
Yes, I just want to clarify that there is after point 12, any other elements of the draft SPR ordinance needing attention, which I feel like is where this perhaps fits in. I just wanted to say that I like Charlie's idea of renter complaint, perhaps post initial inspection, triggering the need for any additionals, because I do think that asking for a new inspection every year for license renewal is super onerous, especially if they have paid for and done an inspection at the beginning. And I think a complaint by the tenant is like a really wonderful way to trigger, hey, we're gonna need another inspection like your next license renewal.
Yeah, the wires are hanging down from
The wires are not hanging down, or they noticed that there weren't batteries in the carbon monoxide detector or whatever, things like that. I think that is a really great way to trigger the need for any additional inspection outside of the original.
How do they go with vehicles?
Well, that comes into the platform that would neighbor money looks into, there should be a contact number, what their rights are and requiring that to be published.
So building off of that, would you go with like the Denver model where you self-certify and if there's a complaint, then you trigger a full-on outside inspection?
Like self-certify in your renewal application?
No, in your first
Your first
approval,
one?
then you have the checklist of everything that you self-certify, and then if there's a complaint, then you have to pay for an outside.
Self-certified.
But you also have reviews to look at things like that.
Well, and if they're not in compliance, then make it pretty strict that they will have a revocation for a year or something.
Or it's suspended, you're suspended from operating until you can provide the inspection. But I do think like we want to make sure that people are safe. So I'm not saying eliminate the initial inspection.
Just curious.
I'm not totally sure.
But after that, you're saying.
But after
it would be
that
triggered.
initial inspection, no need to get another one unless somebody complains, because we've certified you.
And I like that balance, and the reason why I'm less comfortable with the self-recording, when we were looking to buy another property, I found one that I thought was absolutely ideal. It was amazing. It was a renovation of a 1960s house, and it was gorgeous, and people selling it represented it, they pulled all the permits and all of that. And much to my surprise, when I called the city and asked for a record of all of those permits that were pulled, not a single one was pulled, which meant gas lines were moved. I could obviously tell that. There was walls that had been moved. The electricity had been fully moved. All of that had been done. For me, that was a red flag. I pulled out of the deal, obviously didn't move forward. But because those things are done on the interior, and you can, for me, I feel like in order to make sure that folks are safe, that initial one does not seem overly onerous. I love the blending of the fact that then we have a placard that lets people. But even in your case where it is the person wanting to just make those ends meet, I still, in my view, need to make sure that those people are renting a safe place. They're renting a place where they can, if they're 70 years old and it's a basement unit, that there is a way to get out of that basement safely. It's lit, it has all of those things. Otherwise, I'm not comfortable with that personally, just because there is an onerous to make sure that safety, health, wellness, it's just that. So I'm not going to jump, but again, I'm one of 11.
Well, no, I don't disagree. I mean, I'm okay with the initial, that makes sense. Where do we draw the line though? I mean, we have homes in our community that are, 100 years old to brand new. And let's face it, you could be the 10th owner and maybe 6 owners ago didn't do a basement without getting permits. Are we gonna go to that level? Or are you just saying we gotta make sure there's egress, we gotta make sure there's fire extinguishers, that sort of thing?
Current things. Yeah, home inspectors, when I got a home inspection, he wasn't like, there haven't been permits pulled for this. He was like, you have aluminum wiring.
Well, I was just hearing two different
that.
things. I was hearing two different things, so I wanna make sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, it comes down to if you've been, unfortunately, you have a basement that you're renting out, there has to be 2 points of egress. Whatever those look like, maybe it doesn't have to be a current code, but you maybe have to have a ladder that allows people to get up and out if it's a high window. I still think you have to meet those minimum requirements that you will need 2 forms of egress in order to stay safe. But again, no, I don't think you're required to bring a current code if you haven't remodeled anything, if you haven't touched something that required it to, but that's, yeah. But
Because they don't do that in health inspections either. They don't like, enforce, they don't say enforce the current code. They kind of talk about
Your aluminum.
how
wire.
your aluminum wiring, this was okay when it was built.
I had knob too. So we're okay, we're gonna have an initial inspection, but then no requirement for a yearly inspection or anything unless it's generated from a complaint. Is that?
Yeah.
Okay. Now, I'm counting, and they said there were 12 things, but I've only got 10. Did you find it in the 11, okay. Sales tax, is there a redundancy in having the owner have a sales tax number for Airbnb, VRBO, and other platforms to collect it?
Does it have a difference?
No, I don't think, 'cause it doesn't matter what platform, they still have to charge it, right? So it's address specific.
And I think we got that clarification after this from what you.
Sure.
Yeah, it was. Are we okay? 12. Multiple jurisdictions. Let's talk about the Fifth Circuit Court, because that was a question that had come up from multiple folks. Did you guys want to address that, the impact? I don't think it has an impact on ours. And my understanding is that the Fifth Circuit is whacked. So, but I'm not sure.
We don't technically say that. Some of their decisions have been questioned and maybe reviewed.
Mine as well.
Take some edges off of that, just rounding out the edge. So, would you like to comment?
I can't comment as to the Fifth Circuit in general, but, if what the Fifth Circuit passed in the Hagel, this is a City of New Orleans case, if what they ruled there, holds true throughout the rest of the country, then the primary residence, requirement would be unconstitutional. But as you noted, it's the Fifth Circuit, we're in the 10th Circuit, it doesn't control, but I would not be surprised. In fact, I'd be surprised if somebody didn't challenge it. If we put a primary residence, requirement in there, you're very likely to see, constitutional challenges to the ordinance based on that, because the New Orleans ruling is going to give them a lot of thought for that.
Gus, did you see my questions about that?
Yes.
Since Denver did not change theirs, can you help me understand? So if they haven't reacted and they've got the residency requirement, are they waiting to see if it's challenged to the Supreme Court or waiting to see if other circuits take it up?
What they're doing is good. No, it's a guessing game at this point, but you're right. They haven't changed that ordinance yet. And so they're probably looking at it as you're the 10th Circuit, that is the 5th Circuit. And so they're carrying on with their ordinance. They've seen, I'm not sure if they've received any challenges to their ordinances since the 5th Circuit came out. So it's kind of, it's unsettled and it's an uncomfortable position to give legal advice in, because we don't know if New Orleans is going to appeal it. As you noted, they put a moratorium on enforcing the ordinance, so they could be weighing their options right now, but I'm not sure.
How long can they delay? They have a backlog of roughly 600 applications, I believe. How long can they legally delay before it becomes, I guess what I'm trying to understand is we don't know. Denver's not made a move. And you've got New Orleans that stayed the 600 backlog. So there's a lot of pressure that's going to be brought to bear. What I'm trying to do is make sure I understand the residency piece, because then that speaks to then do we need to look at other mechanisms, which I know Rebecca raised, zoning and distancing and numbers and all of that stuff. And I don't know if we need to go down that path or whether there's going to be some way to sort of extrapolate what's happening to see what may or may not apply.
I don't have a good answer as to how long there would be. It's really dependent on every different factual situation. So unfortunately, I can't really give you a good answer on, if we wait 5 months, then we'll know. There could be a case filed tomorrow. It's the city of Denver. There could never be a case filed against the city of Denver. It's speculation, and that really wouldn't be fair of me to try to give you any further advice.
Will LexisNexis let us search and be able to know if a filing comes in Denver? Would we be privy to that? Would we be able to put that in a search and know when that comes up?
No, from Lexis.
There are other ways you can try to monitor what cases have been filed against.
Do we know, do we identify any in Denver that have been filed to challenge their residency requirement?
I have not checked.
But you'll get back with us.
I surely can.
That, okay. So, basically, we have to do an ordinance anyway with what we want. And if the 10th Circuit, if the 5th Circuit holds and the 10th Circuit adopts it, then we just go in and modify the ordinance. Is that correct?
Yes. There's a provision in the ordinance saying that if one portion is deemed to be unconstitutional, the rest is still constitutional, so we would just not enforce that one portion at a time. We probably do something better than the ordinance and do things all and try to figure it out.
Okay. So,
What I expected the answer to be is that we would have that ability, because again, we don't know what's coming, and so, yeah, we're caught in this interesting spot. So now I'm trying to understand, do we leave our residency rule in place knowing that that could cause an action, which is one direction to go? Or do you look at the proposed options, or do you look at the alternatives, which I know you had asked a few questions about. So I don't know if I have the answer. There's a lot of moving parts.
I'm curious about what alternatives there are, because I feel like the primary one that I see is what, you get one license or two, or however many. And then that lends itself, like if because we've had public comment, for those of you not on the housing policy committee, you may not have heard, there's been some public comment of people that have been renting multiple rooms within their own home. And so I hate for someone in their own home to be limited, but at the same time, if we open it up and say, okay, well, then allowing somebody to be able to rent 2 or more homes also equals, because we are not doing primary residence, right? Then that means anyone can get 3 licenses.
I don't think we made that decision about primary residence. That's a question.
Well, no, that was my question, is what are the alternatives? Because I feel like the only alternative that I'm seeing right now is we say you get X amount of licenses. 1 or 2 or 3 or whatever.
Let's go back to 1. I think this is Robert.
Okay.
Because that's the one we're saving for last, even though it's the first question here, because we missed the topic. Interesting. And Rebecca hasn't.
Rich and Charlie have their hands up.
Oh, I'm sorry. I missed that. Rich and then Charlie.
Oh, well, yeah, I think you know that I like to poke the bear, but I don't want to poke this one. I mean, we already know what's going to happen, right? And so why should we set ourselves up for incoming lawsuits when we could take care of it now?
But how do we do that?
Oh,
What do we
not
do?
have the residency, not do the residency, not make sure that inside of it, we would open that house.
So anybody could buy
I don't love
houses
the
in
idea,
like.
yeah.
Is what you're saying.
Yeah. I don't love the idea, but, you know, if somebody's on our bad, I don't have a problem, you know. Maybe they were born in Lakewood and their family house is still here and they moved to Aurora or some other place and we got this one here. You know, we were saying they can't, so I would have to remove the thing.
At one time, we had talked about if it's not going to be, if the owner is not available, then they would have to have a property manager or a 24/7 contact. That might resolve some of that concern.
Yeah, because we have
being a
talked.
primary residence, therefore the homeowner doesn't have to be there. But who do you call? So, what, is that still in the ordinance? Is it?
No.
Why was it removed?
Because we wanted, the feedback that we got from constituents and from council and from a lot of people is that in order so that it didn't turn into a business and take more residents out of attainable, affordable, being able to buy, so that it wasn't a business that owned 6 or 7 houses. That was just one. It was not a business. Am I making sense?
Yeah, that does, but my concern is that if the primary resident is not there, as would be the case with a business, they need to have someone that the neighbors can call and say, hey, wait a minute, this guy's over here shooting off firecrackers. I mean, we could always call the police, but it seems like even with that, there should be someone available to say, okay, you've been caught by the police shooting off illegal fireworks, you have to leave.
We have something in that, in the guidelines or what you put on the door or whatever, call, 303, blah, blah, blah.
Whose door would that be on?
I'm sorry?
Whose door would that be on?
Where the STR
It's
is.
the same thing with the
So
inspection.
somebody would have to walk over there from their own home and walk up onto the porch and read the number and all of that.
Well, does this fall on the nuisance violation? Like,
Yeah.
I mean, some of those regulations are there, but some of this is already built into the requirements of Airbnb, so I just want to be mindful that, like, in order to be approved Airbnb, we're saying you have to be on some sort of platform.
We did
In order
that.
for you to be able to do that, you have to meet some of these requirements. So it feels like there may be some redundancies in the processes that we're trying to create here. And for that example that you just gave, wouldn't that then be a call to whoever that then would be filed as one of the 2 nuisances that would then flag something? So are we solving for something that's already solved for maybe?
And we did have a requirement that in the home, if the wiring was falling down or if something was wrong, call this number.
And
So-
Airbnb.
Yeah.
That would be,
And Airbnb
that
has
would be
it too.
the client. But what about the neighbor who has a concern, it's midnight, and,
That's part of
they
that
call the
neighborhood
police, the police come out and find and issue a citation. I mean, there should be some contact that can say, hey, look, y'all, you stepped over the line. If you do that sort of thing at a hotel or motel, management's gonna kick you out. So I think there should be the same kind of, instead of waiting 30 days for something to go to a hearing, and the guest is already gone, they're out of state. It seems to me if there is an immediate concern for the safety of the neighbors, as there would be with fireworks, then somebody ought to be able to come over and say, the neighbors should be able to contact somebody and say, hey, you're shooting off fireworks, cops just issued them a citation, you need to be out of there.
So Charlie, I think that probably falls under the whole, the applicant has agreed as part of their application, they provided notice to the neighbors in accordance with the provisions. So it's basically sharing with those neighbors sort of, the rights and responsibilities of that. So it's the good neighbor. So you would know that, oh, this is going to be an STR, and if there's any issues, they would know who to contact, that they would have those rights. So I think that's part of like the adoption of the Colorado Springs Good Neighbor Program, which based on what Paul's been showed that helps with, made it where people then weren't afraid of, oh, there's some activity happening here. They knew what was going on, and they knew what their rights were. They knew what the STR owners' rights were. So everybody was on the plane.
So they just have to take what's going on next door and put up with it until what, heck fees freezes over? I mean,
I'm not following.
my point is there should be someone they can contact in the case of egregious behavior that can ask the tenant or the renter to leave the premises because they're acting so egregiously.
That be the police though?
Well,
No, the police can't kick someone out of an Airbnb, can they?
For the police to kick them out, they'd have to be arrested for a violation.
but the platform has that also in place, right?
The what?
The platform,
Okay,
which we are requiring them to be on.
The platform has that in place. You see like the party houses and stuff, but I have something else with this one.
so somebody could call Airbnb
Yes.
or Verbo, and they would take care of that sort of thing immediately? Okay, I'm fine.
Is my understanding.
Well, let's verify that.
Well, I guess too, like,
Rebecca's been raising her hand for 10 minutes.
Well, she said, just raising her hand, thank you for behaving.
raise her, my hand behind her, and then she goes in front of me.
Okay, you two.
You can go, because I'm gonna shift topic. I'm gonna shift back to what we're
I
actually
was too.
supposed to be talking about.
I have a point of view.
Okay. We are talking about what potentially would be alternatives to the primary resident requirement. That's what this discussion is right now, right? So one thing that we could do if we feel that we do not want to go to lawsuit or something like that, I think is talking about license caps in the city and how many licenses we want to issue.
We had talked about that, we threw out.
No, I realized we talked about that, but then we decided primary residence was the best way to go. But if we're literally not going to be able to do that, or if we decide that that is untenable, this has to be.
That doesn't stop us, I'm sorry. The raise your hand, maybe.
I'm just a primary residence guy. I mean, I know it may come down, but we have a lot of laws, and certainly I think council makes decisions.
I mean, if we're comfortable just going with primary residence, I know the question was though, if we don't do primary residence, we do have to have.
So then I think we're gonna be able to see, you're gonna see what other communities are gonna do with the fifth, or how they're gonna do other things, and at this point, it's not being challenged. And it probably wouldn't affect us until maybe our 1 year look back, maybe sooner. Someone might be listening tonight and want to challenge us right away, but I think primary residence.
I agree.
I mean, I don't care what we do. I just knew that we were gonna have to discuss alternatives.
Well, that's fine. I think we gotta get consensus, and if we don't want primary residence, then we need to just move on to whatever else people want to see, so we can get.
Well, I'm not comfortable moving away from primary residence if the city and county of Denver has not moved away from it. There's something that I'm missing, so that's why I'm sort of like, I'm there, but I don't want to not be at least thinking about the other alternatives just because I think that they need to come into play. So for me personally, we did a lot of ground to get to primary residence. I'm most comfortable with that, but I definitely want us to keep a watchful eye on developments.
Camps are bad. I mean, somebody, once you hit it, you're just out of luck because other people have that opportunity first, so I don't.
And distance is another one, it's not, so again, but if we have a community, and I guess I'll stop interrupting after this, if we have a community that is saying that they have some concerns about the character of their neighborhood, we need to factor all that into the same thing that Rich said, where you have people who are desperately trying to stand up. There's a lot of things being trying to be balanced here, and I want to be very thoughtful about all of them.
I think we ought to do this the way we want to do it. The Supreme Court overrules us. They do. If they don't, then I think we're being responsible by requiring primary residence.
I would say, I don't totally know on primary residence, but I would say that if we're gonna go the licensing cap way, rather than capping for the total amount of licenses, I would say like the total amount of licenses per person or entity rather than, right? Like, you don't have to say like, there's 500 possible in Lakewood. You could say like, if you are registering, you can have 3, right? Like, and I think that's how you know, or you can say you can have 4 rooms or you can have 1 whole home, right? Like you can, like that is how I would want to approach licensure cap.
Yeah.
If we did a cap, but totally understand that, so you still wouldn't exceed 1 whole home. It wouldn't be that I could then buy the whole properties and what's that, and then become investment. I guess I want to make sure.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that it would like be perfect, right? But I think that my point is that like, if you look at it, if you go for a cap for the whole city, that doesn't do anything to prevent that. If anything, it means that the people who are able to pay someone to just like monitor that and like be on it and fill out paperwork quickly are who's gonna end up with the majority of them. And probably over time, we'll see less and less like normal individual people where this is like a part of how they're making their ends meet, which is like who we're like aiming to make sure they're the easiest for. And like that wouldn't do that. So my point is that if we move away from primary residency, the other way that we could do it is like, yeah, per person or per entity license cap instead. So we could say like, yeah, you could have X amount of rooms because just so Wendy's point that there's folks who rent like, I have a basement, like mother-in-law suite, and then I have a bedroom up here and I rent those are separate technically, but they're in one address. Or you can have 1 whole home license, right? And really your option.
That helps me see. I just want to make sure I see the visions.
One of my concerns has been that we might, when a hotel or motel go into a market, they do an analysis of the market and how much traffic the market can bear. I think a lot of folks are looking at this as a magic way to make money. It's like Jack and the Beanstalk. But if you get too many beanstalks out there, somebody's going to go broke. And I'm concerned that some people on the basis of what we're looking at are going to go remodel or spend a lot of money and then find that there's no market or that it's oversaturated. So
That's business, brother. Capitalism defined.
This happens in the limousine market. So, but these folks are not, some of these folks are not going to be sophisticated. And I also have a concern that some of these things are going to turn into flop houses. There are already, not flop houses, sporting houses. There are already a number of places that have, and I know because I knew somebody that was staying in one of them, they had like a basement with 7 or 8 bunk beds in it. And they had a workforce group and they were in there on a temporary basis, but they would stay past the 30-day time period. So how do we assure that we're not allowing boarding houses to resurface under the guise of Airbnb?
Would those people be registered on a platform?
I think they were. But I'm not sure.
Yeah.
It's a concern.
Wait, now, I had a clarification on the Norman ruling. Was that about primary residence or was it about jurisdiction, living in the jurisdiction?
They didn't call it primary residence, it has the same effect. It was about their homestead exemption, but you could only have the homestead exemption if you lived in the city of New Orleans. So you could only do it if you lived in that home. So it essentially comes down to the same thing, but they don't call it something different.
Okay, I got confused there.
I probably didn't do a good job explaining it, but it's a long case, but yes, it was because only people in New Orleans would be able to obtain the licensure.
Right, so that's jurisdiction.
It's jurisdiction, correct.
Right, but not primary residence. It doesn't, but then you said they also have to be in the same house.
Well, you can only have one, if I remember correctly, you can only have one homestead exemption in New Orleans. And so you can call it the homestead exemption, you can call it the primary residence. It has the exact same effect on the outcome. I'm still not doing a good job explaining. I apologize. It might not be explained.
Let's try to see where we're at with this, as far as primary residence. I do know that we got a lot of input on this, that it should only be one residence, not 2 or 3 or 4 that you have. With all those other things that come into play on that, we're taking housing out of the housing market, which, people are looking for the attainable. But we didn't want to squash people not being able to use their residence to produce income. Because you've read a lot of that in here too. We've gotten a lot of that. So I have to go in So where are we with primary residence?
May I ask one more question? It has somewhat to do with primary residence. One of our commenters from the public said that the FHA, which I think now is Freddie Mac, Fannie Mae or whatever, but the FHA has a ban on using homes financed through FHA as short-term rentals. Does anybody know if that's true?
Yeah, we looked at it on the housing. It is the rule that's on the books, but again, it's one of those things where, the enforcement piece comes into play. But yes, the housing, back when we were the original constituent, we looked at that, didn't validate that was, but then talked through sort of the realities. It's kind of like when you say, well, they can't serve food on the inside, and then how do you know that? It's not like you're kind of knowing folks' mortgage lender and all of that, but it is on the books as far as from FHA, at least last time we checked, which would have been almost 2 years ago, that you could not have an FHA loan and then be engaged in because what they're trying to do is make sure that it's a primary residence only, but I don't know if that FHA rule has changed in the last 2 years.
Would we in some way be encouraging people to skirt federal regulations by doing this? I mean, I've skirted federal regulations.
Like buying cannabis, same deal, right? Skirting federal regulations, like buying cannabis.
Nobody's here.
I'm not, nobody here's done that, I'm just saying. Buy cannabis in Colorado, skirting the law every day.
Okay, so I want a temperature check because we need to get this straightened out. Are we still looking at primary residence that is ownership owned?
No.
Yep.
No?
Again, I guess. Sure.
No. This is where the rubber hits the road.
We gotta find consensus or not. If we don't find consensus, we gotta figure out what we are gonna bring forward. So,
Question.
I would vote for an ordinance that had a primary residence requirement. I would be stoked about it, but I'm
so who's,
not good enough.
are people online, Counselor Springsteen and
Like, they're not.
No.
Her camera's off, but she's still on. Jansen, I don't believe is.
I think Jansen might be trying to get back on, but she said she fell off.
There's Anita.
Okay, I'll send her.
Anita, are you on board?
What? I'm sorry, what is the question?
Primary residence, question number 1.
You want to require primary residence.
That's the thing we talked about in the meetings for so long. And I know sometimes you couldn't be there, so we sent you the note. The primary.
I guess I would say I'm a no on that.
What would you have then?
I mean, you're saying, should we require that it's a primary residence or not?
To have an STR, correct?
And I would say no.
And could you help everybody in here understand why that would be no and what your alternative would be?
I just think we're infringing on people's property rights too much and infringing on the ability to give affordable housing options in Lakewood.
So you mean so what you're saying, you own your house, you don't think you should be able to have an STR. Is that what you're saying?
Oh, maybe I'm misunderstanding. I thought you were saying.
So let me see if I can tee this up. So the original discussion was around the fact that there was a lot of community feedback, right, wrong, or indifferent, that folks were concerned about the number of investors who may be interested in buying up, much as they're buying houses today and converting those into rentals. And so the goal was, at that time, and again, things can change, was to find a way in which we could allow income generation, so you'd be able to use your property to generate income, but lessen the impact from an investment standpoint, so I would be able to buy multiple units. So it's trying to straddle the best of both worlds, knowing that there's no perfect solution, to avoid the investment aspect, but to allow folks to monetize their home in order to, if they need the income for expenses or just to stay in the home. So it bridges that gap. And if we don't have that, which we know could be challenged, we know that that's something that could be challenged, then we might need to look at other mechanisms. And I guess just for the short run is, I'm for keeping it at the moment, but that doesn't mean I wouldn't be willing to look at other things if we're precluded from doing that, because I am not, from representing my community, I've heard clearly they don't want the investment, which would further exacerbate our affordability, because we would then be taking housing stock out of the market and turning it into a business. So I know that's a long-winded way, but I think I tried to paint a picture of why I'm still for the primary residence. But again, we may have to regroup later.
Well,
I would be in favor, going back to Sophia's point, of limiting per like household or individual to sort of mitigate the fear that we've heard from community members about purchasing off of investment properties. But also, in my opinion, we've heard from enough people in the Housing Policy Committee who had a second property that was necessary for them to be able to like afford their primary residence, like all of these things sort of knitted together. And so I'm not an advocate for us limiting it to the primary residence only as the available short-term rental. I'd like to look at some other mechanisms for that.
Well, I would just mention that there's other issues that complicate that, because let's say somebody has a duplex or a fourplex, and what is their primary residence at that point? And can they rent out the duplex? But I guess that's part of my concern with this. And I don't know. This whole thing is so difficult because we're going to displease people on both sides of the aisle, you know? There's people who want to have control of their own property to make income, and there's other people who want to be protected from irresponsible hosts. And we're in between a rock and a hard place, frankly, on this. I almost think it should be a vote of the people rather than our decision.
Okay, so to finish my thought, I would love to also just recognize that like Lakewood still remains a 12-hour city. So some of this, like anxiety that we're going to flood the market with this, I think, they only can be rented with as many people who are coming in and renting it. And whether or not we agree, there are rentals that are happening in the community, and they, that sort of stabilization of the market already exists. People, as much as I'd love to think that people are flooding into the city of Lakewood because this is a place to be, that's just not where we are right now. And so I think that we're not going to see this huge influx of, houses being rented out by investment properties, because the research will show that this may not be the community to support.
The research will show that not having anxiety over this.
I meant the community members that had. No, I'm talking about, so we've been dealing with this for a year, and there were a number of community members. And so I apologize, but I was referencing more of members of the community that we're talking about, and not comments that were happening here tonight.
I appreciate that, but maybe a path forward is the, depending on where we're at, that you bring a solid amendment. I mean, we get this to an ordinance, we figure out what the core ordinance is made, if you've got a solid, a well-written amendment that you can bring forward, but I'm still going with primary residence, but I would be willing to consider a well-crafted, if I felt it was well-crafted, I would absolutely be open to reading a well-crafted amendment and propose another way forward.
She said.
But it can't be, what I don't want to get into again is trying to do it from the dais again and making all these changes. An amendment would be fine. I may or may not agree with it, but I would certainly look at it. It's just, there's been a lot of, this is probably the one sticking point. And I know some people will have a fit and other people will not, so.
But
are we okay with?
I just have a question on, would an ADU on a property be considered part of the primary residence, or is that?
In Denver, it is.
So limited.
So I would hope that it would be.
Yeah.
Okay, so I think the other, the tiered approach is the way to go there is what I think. I think if you had that low tier, then you require them to be primary residents. And I definitely want to keep the investment buyers out from buying everything up here and turning it into short-term rentals and long-term rentals. We know about what's going on West Acquisition, the 29 small houses they're building there, and they're going to be rentals. I don't know if they're long-term or short-term right now, but that's the kind of thing I don't want to see happening here. But I do want to see, people able to rent out their own houses and the house next door. And
I look
that's fine.
forward to seeing your robustly written amendments, whether I'm an up or a down vote. I think there's some, I really am open to hearing. If you want to propose an amendment with tiering, I would definitely.
I thought everybody wanted hearing.
I think that's making two classes of our community.
You have to make sure it passes legal, you have to make sure you route through legal, make sure it doesn't.
I don't think it did.
I don't recall.
Tier, really was.
But yeah,
a consensus on last night, so that's pretty true. Because I want a 3-tier, it's like, there wants 2-tier.
I'm just gonna say that in our consensus building here, that as we continue to discuss and I like mold on it a little bit more, I think the primary residence to me is the thing to put in the ordinance, like maybe I'll continue to chew on it and there'll be an amendment, but like, I don't know if we can get there with this, just because here's the thing that came into my brain that changed that shifted me, because it's right in the middle. It's just that people can just make infinite LLCs and then they can just continue to gather licenses.
That was today to the legal, because I was.
Put it in different people's.
Yes, so, so I'm already kind of.
Right,
down
right.
that, yeah.
But the more I think about that.
But let's still keep thinking. I think that if we can move forward with this, and then I think we can bring back some amendments if we feel we've got some that are just.
Because we have had people who have a duplex.
And definitely with ADUs and half addresses, right? I think all of those.
But they own half of it, live in half of it, would be like an ADU in effect, it's the primary residence.
But bring forth an amendment. But are we okay with doing?
Yeah, so what did we have to jump back to?
We don't,
then one kind of turned into the version, so 12 and 1 were basically the same.
So then anything else for further discussion?
I've got something.
Okay.
I want to make this real clear. I need help with this.
Okay.
Because I'm getting too many calls about my HOA has too many people parking here because they're all short-term rentals. That's up to the HOA, and everybody needs to send that same message out, okay? It's not up to us. If they allow STRs, that's what they allow. If they don't, then they have to go to the board. The other thing is I get some confusion around 30 days. Okay, it's 30 days, it falls outside of this. So is everybody okay with that?
Well, also, I think it's important from the HOA standpoint is that they're currently not legal in the city. So underlying that, I mean, I know that ultimately if they were to, that would be their issue of how they manage that, but they're not permitted currently in the city. So I would, that's the first answer I give to people. And so I want to make sure that we understand that we're not trying to, get too far in front of our skis, but they're currently not a permitted activity. They're not explicitly prohibited, but they're not prohibited.
And thank you for that. That's a good clarification. I just went into
I add something to that, it's not allowed right now. But I think it's ordinance should try to bring everybody in that we possibly can, because if we make it too onerous, they're all just gonna keep running what they're doing right now. And so I think when we try to keep it simple and we try to have a big tent, and otherwise they're just gonna keep on doing exactly what they're doing right now.
Well, that's why it's important to have an enforcement.
Yeah.
Right, but then the last one can't get us. We have an enforcement now. I mean, it's illegal now, we should be having enforcement now. And it's based on claims.
But that's the thing, is it's not illegal, but it's not legal.
It's in that gray area, that's the gray area.
So how do you enforce it when it's not legal, but it's not even? But when you do this,
I'm just thinking.
Okay, let's not go. I think we have enough to start with. There's gonna be amendments if we like that. Now, do you all have everything you need? You're golden? Okay. I think that's it.
So here's our next deal is we'll start to put this in and get it scheduled for first and second reading. Boom.
Documents.
And then boom. Yes.
I'd like to note this has been a hell of a long haul. And there are a lot of people on the housing commission that have been very patient, very diligent, and very open to hearing suggestions, not just us, but the public as a whole. Thank you for sticking with your system.
And next we're gonna look at housing.
Thank you to Sharon and Mark who really guided us.
Yeah, nice job.
Great input. Staff for kind of getting us all the way to the end and having to rip it up and start all over. So we're gonna get this done and move on hopefully to affordable housing and other cool unique things. With that, we'll go ahead and adjourn. It's 9 o'clock. So.